Now it's my pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Jerry Nickelsburg, who comes back this year from the UCLA Anderson Forecast. Jerry's been out with his wife hunting mushrooms. He looks forward to that when he comes up to Sonoma County. It's one of the high points of the year for him. The Anderson Forecast is the most widely followed forecast in the state and has been unique in predicting many of the state's booms and recessions. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Jerry Nickelsburg. Jerry?
And the mushrooms are great this year. Those of you who are mushroom hunters, any mushroom hunters in the room? Yeah. I'm going to have to come back again. This rain has really brought out the mushrooms. So we had a little entertainment this morning, and gave me two thoughts. Some people were coming up and saying, well, sorry about that, but I do a lot of work in China. I've worked in China in industry. I teach courses on doing business in China. I'll be back there in March with a class of MBA students. And, as I saw these protesters come in, I just kind of thought to myself, isn't it great that we live in a country where they can come in and make their voices heard, disrupts us a bit, but make their voices heard, and go home to their families without having to worry about a knock on the door in the middle of the night. And the second thought that I had, which relates to the economic outlook, is that, when your boss is laying off, you don't ask for a raise, right? This wouldn't have happened in January 2009. And it's really indicative of the fact that we have strong labor markets in the U.S., in California, and here in Sonoma County, that this kind of movement is occurring. And I want to talk about those strong labor markets. So let's get to it with a quote from Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you haven't read this, you really need to go and read it. But I love this statement. We demand rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty. And for those of you who have read it, there's this improbability machine where something becomes so improbable that it becomes probable. We're in a political season now. We may have an improbability machine here. And that means that we've got to think about, not just in politics, I'm almost through with my political statements, maybe not, but we have to think about the risks to the forecast that I'm going to go through. And I want to talk about those risks. We hear in the press all kinds of doom and gloom back to China. We hear China's coming apart, Europe's coming apart, and the market is down. I don't know what it's doing today, but the bottom line is we pay too much attention to China, and the market is sort of fickle, and the economy really is strong. And so let me go through that and try and give some form. I'm not going to give rigid form to doubt and uncertainty, but some form to what that doubt and uncertainty is and what is really going on in the economy. And I'm going to start with the U.S. The outlook is for us to reach full employment. I have that in quotation marks. I want to talk about what that means for the U.S. and then for California. And spoiler alert, the quotation marks come off for California. They come off for the Bay Area and certainly for here in Sonoma County. Real GDP is going to hit a 3% growth rate, and then it's going to start to slow down. And we'll talk about that slowing of real GDP. That's not such a bad thing. And then 4% wage growth is what we expect. We're starting to see that wage growth, and we expect to see more of that as labor markets continue to tighten. Inflation is running about 2% if you kind of look at the underlying factors. And our inflation rates have been depressed because of low oil prices, actually falling oil prices and falling commodity prices. And the oil producers have finally stopped playing how low can you go? And so that run of low inflation is pretty much over with. But we have risks abounding in this economy, and we want to talk about those. So let's begin with job growth. In the U.S. in the last 3 months, we've had job growth about 250,000 per month, around 290 for December, so good job growth. We expect that to continue. If you kind of squint, you can see that this line sort of, the slope kind of gets to be a little bit flatter. And it gets to be a little bit flatter because we move into full employment. We're at about 5% right now, and that'll dip a little bit below that. Now, full employment is in quotation marks here because the definition of full employment, well, there is really no definition of full employment. The unemployment rate is the ratio of the number of people who are looking for jobs to the entire labor force, which consists of those who are working and those who are looking. But it has to be somebody who is looking for a job who is in the labor force and in this unemployment rate. And many people say, well, yes, but this isn't a real recovery because there are all these people who are out of the labor force. They're discouraged and they're not coming back in. And yes, it's 5%, but the employment to population ratio, as the percentage of our population that's working, is low, and it's lower than it's been for a long time, back to the 1970s. So this is kind of phony that we're in full employment. I want to dig deeper into that when we get to California and argue that that's actually kind of an illusion that it really is not. But for the U.S., we get to full employment, and then GDP can only grow based on growth in productivity and growth in the labor force. And the labor force, if you're at full employment, only grows with population. So that means that you're going to get slower growth, just kind of right out of the bucket. Now, what is GDP? It's the sum of all goods and services that are produced in the economy during a quarter or a year. And those goods and services go to one of four places. And so what's driving this unemployment rate, what's driving employment, is the demand for those goods and services. So what are those four places? One is foreigners. Well, we know that outside the U.S., no one's doing very well. And so the demand for our products is down. Also, the dollar is very strong. Demand for our products is down. So that's not really contributing to GDP growth. Second is government. Government is growing a little bit. It's growing some in California. It's growing elsewhere, but it's not growing very rapidly. A third is investment, and that consists of housing, which I want to talk about. It consists of equipment and software, which I'm going to talk about, and then it consists of non-residential construction. And you see, particularly in the Bay Area, you see a lot of new non-residential construction. But for the U.S., you have to include the building of oil rigs. And the building of oil rigs has gone to just about non-existent. That's about half of non-residential construction. So where we're going to get the demand is from that 70% that I haven't mentioned yet, which is households or consumers. And that is really driving the economic ship today. Consumer demand is running about 3%. That's pushing us to full employment. And that consumer demand is based on a savings rate that's a little above 5%, but it's been very stable for a while. So we expect that to continue. But when you get to full employment, then you just have a slower growth in income, and that means a slower growth in consumption. But consumers are really driving this, and it's in part being driven by automobiles. So maybe you can't see this too well, so let me describe what this is. This is a graph which shows you the number of autos purchased in the U.S. during the last business cycle. So this is, the vertical line is the recession, to the left is prior to 2001 recession, to the right are the months after the recession, and autos are running at about 17, 18 million. Now what happens after the 2008 recession is, and that one you can see, is that the purchase of automobiles just drops like a rock. And it's been coming back up, and it's now up at about 18 million. But if you go back 15 years, that's what we were buying then. And autos wear out. Sometimes they run into trees, sometimes trash cans, sometimes they just rust out, but autos wear out. And we need to replace them, but if you kind of go across the line on the top, you see we've got a lot of replacement still to do. So this is not going to run out of steam, and that's one of the things that you see when an economy begins to go into a recession, is that autos run out of steam. And the other is investment in housing. And you get the same kind of picture. After 2008, actually after 2007, we were grossly underbuilding housing in the US. We need about 1.3 million, 1.35 million each year for growth in population and for replacement. And we're way under that. We're down at 500,000. And we're just now up to about 1.1 million. So we're still underbuilding housing. And the demand for housing, it makes itself felt through higher rental rates, and we have higher rental rates, right? Much higher rental rates, higher housing prices. That induces builders to go out and build, and that just does not seem to be abating. We are still have too few houses. The economy is adding jobs. When it adds jobs, then the kids say, it's time to move out from mom and dad's, or people who are doubling up, and they demand new housing units. This has also got legs. And these are driving, these along with the demand for equipment and software is what's driving the US economy. And that gives us our forecast of GDP that's not stellar, but it's pretty good. It's at a 3% rate. It gives us full employment. Growth slows down, but we're happy about growth slowing down because it means that we don't have this big pool of workers that we still have to bring back into the workforce. So a 2 to 2.5% economy, pretty good. If we get advancements in productivity, it'll grow faster. What that means is that we'll have inflation about 2%, 2+%, and that's coming from no longer falling commodities prices. It's coming from higher cost for housing, and it's coming from a wage push. What you see in this graph here are two lines. One is headline, that's the blue line. That's the one you should pay attention to, because the yellow line is core inflation. That's the one people talk about. It excludes food and energy because I guess we don't use those. So look at the blue line. That's the right one, but on average it's running about 2%. As soon as we start getting that wage growth and oil prices start inching up, or at least are not going down anymore, you get a 2+% inflation rate. That'll keep the Fed on track for increasing interest rates at about 100 basis points a year. So we hear a lot of talk about recession these days, and I've just given you kind of a really optimistic outlook for the US. Full employment, running along at a kind of steady state. How do we get a recession? And I want to contend it's not any of the ways that you're reading about. Housing and autos are usually the way we get a recession. We overbuild those, and then people stop buying them because they have enough, right? And those sectors begin to contract, and that reverberates through the economy. And I just showed you, we haven't been overbuilding. We don't have enough housing. We don't have enough cars. So that's not going to be it. So what scenarios might drive us into a recession in the next couple of years, in 2016 or 2017? One is this: unicorn, pentacorns, and decacorns. Oh my. As you know, well, not necessarily here, but just a little bit south of here, we've got these animals, and they are overvalued startup companies that sort of have no hope of ever really returning a profit. And they're being revalued. I mean, some of them maybe will turn a profit. They're going to IPOs, but the IPO valuations are much below what was originally expected. And what happens with this is that that money kind of pulls out of this in this restructuring of the value of these companies. And some companies are going to be cash starved. And when they're cash starved, they're going to close down. and there's going to be lots of press about it. The last two recessions were bubble recessions, right? We had the dot-com bubble, and we had the housing bubble. As soon as the press starts talking about we now have another valuation bubble in Silicon Valley, does the rest of America get worried and start saving more and consuming less? Remember, consumers are driving this growth. So that's one possibility. I don't think it's very likely, but it is a possible path. A second is equipment and software. And this is a little more likely than the unicorns, pentacorns, and decacorns. What has been happening of late is that companies all over the world have been trying to increase productivity to be competitive. And to do that, they've been buying the latest equipment and software. At some point, unless technology advances rapidly, and if you talk to the folks down in Silicon Valley, they'll tell you it is, but unless it does, you've got enough. And you can think about the iPhones, right? So the latest iPhone is technologically better than the previous one, but not so much that everyone has to have one. And so they're seeing slowing sales. Well, if you think about factories, once you have enough robots, to build products, you only need enough robots for growth. And what was growth? It was 2%. And so you get a slowing of that investment, and that could be a path that would lead to a recession. Again, we're not forecasting that, but it's something to keep our eyes on in this uncertain world of what's happening with equipment and software. And then the third is manufacturing in China and the Middle East. Manufacturing has slowed down in the U.S. Industrial production is not really growing. China, we get all of this bad news about China. It doesn't matter really very much for the U.S. economy, but it does matter for Wall Street's valuation of firms who do business in China. And so you see that kind of in the press. And the Middle East, I don't think I have to say more about that. What happens if households get spooked? So I said I wasn't going to make any more political statements. Maybe I will. We have an election coming up. Lots of people in the campaign would like households to get spooked and then vote for them. If they do and start saving more, again, consumption's driving this recovery. Look for savings rates to go up. If savings rates are going up, and again, we don't think this is the likely scenario. Consumer confidence is very high. But if you see that turn around, that's an indicator that the economy may slow, and that may be a path to a recession. So on that sort of downer news, let's go to some happier ones. And this is California. The two lines that you see here are employment in California. The bottom line is non-farm payroll jobs. So this is number of jobs. The top line is total employment. The bottom is the one that you see quoted. Well, on Friday it was 60,000 jobs in December. That's from the bottom line. The top line is where unemployment rate comes from, and you can see the recession there. We are now 5.2% on both of these measures above our previous peak. We have employment in California that is higher now than we've ever had. And we have gotten there through a 3% growth. And you think about this, 3%, that doesn't sound like a lot. Well, the U.S. has been about 1.9 to 2%. And we've been doing at least 1% better than the U.S. consistently. And question is, can that go on forever? And I want to address that momentarily, but let's see where this employment growth is. This is regional job gain, and let me just highlight that green there. That's here, that's Sonoma. The red, the dark red is the U.S. So this is growth rates in employment, and no surprise, Silicon Valley and San Francisco all the way over to the left. Silicon Valley at 5%, where the U.S. is down there below 2%. San Francisco, but the next one is the Inland Empire, which has finally started growing again, and growing much faster than the U.S. Then Sonoma, then Sacramento and the Delta, San Diego, Orange County, Mid-Coast, all growing faster than the U.S. The next two are Los Angeles and the East Bay. And they've kind of been a little bit less than the U.S. and a little bit more than the U.S., basically on average growing around the U.S. rates. So most of California is doing as well, if not better than the U.S., kind of very widespread geographically, except for the two on the right. The first one that you see there is the San Joaquin Valley. And that's simply a function of the drought and low energy prices in Kern County. And then the last one is our great state of Jefferson. And you really can't, so the statistics for Jefferson are kind of like for China because you don't know who's employed. And the main industry is kind of not counted in this. But they've been underperforming the U.S. according to official statistics. And in terms of recovery, this is just a different way of representing this. This is the comparison. That says November 2014. It's really November 2015 for these data. And what you have here, oh, wait a minute, let me go back a minute. So what you see there is Sonoma that is about 2.7%. The latest numbers that came out in December, you had a very good December, is now 3.1%. So just some additional good news. Okay. And Sonoma there is in the sort of burnt red. The horizontal line is at 100%. And all throughout California, you just have Santa Cruz County over here on the right that's below 100%. So we've got record employment levels basically everywhere in the state. So let's go and ask this question of how long can we be growing at such fast rates? What you see here is the employment to population ratio. When you see this discussed in the paper, they use population age 16 to 117. No, I think that person actually passed away, 114. And I think that's the wrong measure. And it's the wrong measure for two reasons. One is it's really tough in this economy, and it's going to be tough through the 21st century to enter the labor market without at least a high school diploma. And the kids know that. And they're staying in school. Graduation rates are up every single year. They're over 80% now, and they continue to rise. So I've taken out of this those who are under 18. And the second that I've taken out is those who are over 65. And we have a higher proportion of boomers who are over 65 and still working. But those that are not working really are not working. They are retired. I mean, they may be working on a lot of things, but they're not sitting there waiting for labor markets to improve so they can come back and go to the factory and start making cars again. They're doing other things. So if you just look at this prime working age from 18 to 64, you see this pattern of employment to population in California. And there's a trend here, a downward trend that started in 1999. And we see this in the US as well. Now, part of this downward trend is a change in attitudes about staying at home and taking care of children. And so we see a decline in female labor force participation rates, a decline that doesn't look like it's going to turn around. So that's part of what's going on here, not all of it, but part of it. But this is a long-run secular decline. And if that trend were to continue, that green line, which is today's employment to population ratio, we're above the trend. But we don't know that the trend is going to continue. We don't fully understand that trend in the first place. So suppose it didn't. Suppose it really stopped at 2007. We're not quite there yet. We will be by June. So that means that we have hit kind of that steady state employment to population ratio, which means that we can grow at these 3% rates only if we get increases in population, right? Because we need to add more people in order to get higher growth rates. And let's look at that. Population growth in California, natural increase, pretty easy to predict, right? Fertility rates, number of women in childbearing age, and you get this. This changes very slowly over time, about 0.8, 0.9%. And then we get net migration. We have some migration into California. We have migration out and migration in on net positive. but not a lot. And one of the reasons not a lot is California housing. Right? This is a very expensive place to live, and that deters people from moving in. So we have, in our forecast, all of this demand for housing results in housing starts in California going up over the next 2 years by 20%. So pretty big jump, right? Will that solve this affordability issue and allow us to grow faster? Well, first of all, in terms of the number of new homes built, it brings us back to kind of a normal market. And the forecast is over on the right in the red, actuals in the blue, and of course you can see the housing boom there, housing boom and bust. If you take that 20% increase and divide it by, and divide it by the housing stock, what you get is that we're going to increase our housing stock by 0.87%, just enough to take care of population increase. So any thought that California housing is going to be more affordable is kind of fantasy, right? It's good if you own a home because we're going to have appreciation in our homes, but it's not going to be more affordable, and that will be the thing that will limit population growth, and that limiting population growth means that we're going to get a slowing of economic growth. But again, an economy is not like the myth of Sisyphus, where you push this rock up the hill, and you push, and then you kind of get tired, and then it rolls back on top of you and rolls downhill. An economy runs based on the demand for goods and services, and housing we just talked about, good demand for housing, particularly here in California where we have a shortage, on transportation, logistics, tourism, and government and what's happening in the U.S. So we had a good outlook for the U.S. I want to quickly run through these other things. In terms of transportation and logistics, exports are down, but imports are up. And California's logistics industry doesn't affect too much here in Sonoma, but it does affect the Bay Area and it does affect the Los Angeles area. That's still pretty strong. This does affect Sonoma. This is international arrivals at SFO on the bottom and LAX on the top. And they are at record levels, in spite of the fact that the US dollar is strong against basically every other currency. People want to come to the US, and they want to come to California, and this is just indicative of the strength in our tourism industry. If you meld that with some thought about, well, what about domestic tourists? Well, where are you going to go? You know, that trip to Paris doesn't look as attractive as it did a couple years ago, right? And in fact, Air France is having sales. So if you do want to go to Paris, look at the Air France website. They're having sales because tourism is really down for Europe. It's down for Egypt. Where do you go? Well, that's pretty easy. How about California? How about Sonoma? And that's why you're seeing these strong tourism numbers here. And there's no reason to expect those to abate either. In terms of state government, and this is a discussion going on in Sacramento, revenues are way up. And the discussion that's going on is how much of that do we put away for a rainy day? My view of this is that neither side in the discussion actually is thinking about putting away enough. But at least there's this discussion of doing that and of increasing government programs in the state of California. So in all of these areas, we get increased growth in California, and we won't have a stalling of the economy, just slower growth, because the U.S. economy is strong, and tourism is driving leisure and hospitality, rents, residential construction, consumers driving retail, and government is expanding on these expanding tax revenues. And that gives us a California forecast which has slowing growth from 3% in 2015, this is in payroll employment, down to 1.6% in 2017. Still faster than the US, but that differential is not as great. Unemployment rate coming down in the state on average So this is averaging in the small but high unemployment rate county of Imperial in southeastern California. They may have, I think they're still above 20%. So the state unemployment rate down at around 5% at full employment, and full employment without quotes. That's real full employment. And personal income growth, good personal income growth, that 20% increase in housing, and a population growth right about 1%. If we get comprehensive immigration reform, that was kind of a fantasy statement. If we have some immigration reform so that at least the tech firms in California are able to issue or get visas to bring in more engineers and scientists, we might get a higher population growth in California. But now you've got to make a political prediction, which I'm not going to do. This is the 5th year that we have done in January a forecast for the Bay Area. And we forecast a number of variables, ones that I've shown you already. I want to just quickly show you what our forecast is for the Bay Area. So you see over there on the left-hand side, that was the 2001 recession. And the Bay Area really didn't recover from that until just recently, but has recovered quite nicely and is at record employment levels. We expect that to continue because in spite of the fact that the governor of Arizona in her State of the State message said that Arizona is going to come and take all the California jobs, people want to be in the Bay Area. It is really the center of innovation and technology, and we expect that to continue. And that means for this area an unemployment rate that is not that 5% for the state or for the US, but sits down there around 4%. There's an area that's going to continue to draw people in because of the demand for good paying jobs that's kind of all throughout the Bay Area. And so the forecast is for the Bay Area to continue to outperform the rest of the US and the state, new employment highs, but the risks to this area are certainly the risks to the forecast that we talked about before. If equipment and software, demand for equipment and software starts to abate in a big way, that's going to affect the Bay Area, that's going to affect this area as well, and more so really than other parts of the country. And so let me conclude with employment in Sonoma County. Here you see, this is payroll employment, and it's going back to 2000, and you get kind of about a decade where not much happens, it bounces around, right? And then we get the Great Recession, and now look at what's happened coming out of the Great Recession, that we are now here in Sonoma County at record employment levels, and the growth rate, unlike that early chart that I showed you of US employment where it's kind of turning over and flattening out, you don't see that here. You see steady, solid trend growth in employment here in Sonoma County. And so let me conclude on that high note, and congratulations for a very vibrant economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. That's very inspiring. And if you're up next year, let's go out mushroom hunting together. I've never tried that, so I'm looking forward to it.
You're on.
I'm on. All right.